Macklin. Ah, Mr. Macklin, I wonder if you could turn your camera on. Mr. Macklin, are you with us? Are you with us?
So if I can say it's Mr. Ferguson here. I'm under Lucy Miss Tashmeen's image. Can you hear me okay now? Only because my own login, you can see my initials RF. That's the channel that's beaming it to the YouTube broadcast.
Got it. Okay, understood. Right, thank you for that. Hello, Mr. Macklin.
Hello.
Can you hear me and see those of us on screen? Hello.
Yes, I can.
Right. Excuse me. Right. Just a few sort of housekeeping matters on the whole approach to a virtual event or a part virtual event. As with a real event, if you could make sure that phones are off and try and minimize noises off as best you can. Other than those three speaking, that's Mr. Mohammed, Mr. Riley Smith, Mr. Macklin, I wonder if everybody else could turn the cameras off. I've got a camera on in the council. I've still got a camera on for the council. I wonder if that could be lost. It's moved and it's gone. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, if we could just have the main speakers on screen, and if you could leave your microphones off when you're not actually speaking, that'll help minimize the any disruption from extraneous noises. If I can just pick up on a couple of things which have taken place during the adjournment of the inquiry. First of all, as you'll all remember, I asked for the views of the parties on the quotes disputed, end quotes, conditions, and I have seen comments from all three parties on those. So if the decision goes in that direction, I can look at those in more detail. So I've got those comments. Thank you very much for that. The other matter that I asked for during the adjournment was an update on the parish council position, because it was suggested at the inquiry that the response from the parish council, I think it was about 2 years ago, might no longer represent the parish council's view. During the adjournment, I received an email from the parish council saying there might be an extraordinary meeting to consider this. And I had an email on Friday from the parish council reaffirming their opposition to the proposal, effectively going back to the position which was, as I say, I think about 2 years ago. That's it from me in terms of what's occurred during the adjournment. So moving on to the closing submissions, I have already got, not read, but got the Rule 6 party closing submissions. Mr. Mohammed and Mr. Macklin, if at the appropriate time you could email those into the case officer at PINS, preferably just before you speak.
Can I just, so ours was sent at 1:44, 13:44 to Kerr Brown. Should that be a different case officer today?
Not that I am aware of, but I wouldn't necessarily know.
That's fine. So I've sent that.
Oh, hold on. No, I haven't. I haven't seen it. But not to worry. It's in. That's
Yeah.
the main thing.
I have Mr. Macklin's, but I don't have the Rule 6 parties.
I don't have Mr. Macklin's, but I do have the Rule 6.
Okay. Mr. Mohammed, I'll ask my solicitor, Mr. Lyons, to respond to your email, providing a copy now. I've seen. I think he's just potentially done it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Macklin, did you send your closings into the planning inspectorate?
Yeah, I just replied to Richard Ferguson's email that came in with his closing statement on it, and I responded to that with mine CC'd to everybody. So Kerr Brown, Patrick Lyons, Michael De Courcy, Caroline Rye, Liz Riley, Smith, Ashi Mohammed.
Right, no problem. The important thing is that everybody's got the closing submissions. I see from emails that the case officer in Pins was around at just after 1 o'clock. He emailed me at 1 o'clock. I haven't actually spoken to him. I mean, I'm sure he'll send those 3 documents on to me, so I'm not unduly bothered about that. But importantly, when you're reading out your closing submissions, if you are going to depart from the script, which obviously just at this moment I haven't seen all of them, but if you are going to depart from the script, as sometimes happens, please do let me know that you're doing so, and then I'll make a separate note of the actual speech that you make. Or of course, inevitably, I'm getting other emails in totally unrelated to this case, and I'm just keeping half an eye on to see if I've got the other closings. Not to worry. So this afternoon, I haven't obviously seen the count, just to see how long it's likely to take. From the authorities' point of view, Mr. Mohammed, how long would you think your closing is roughly?
I'm hoping to be able to deliver mine, sir, in 40 minutes at the most. If I speak really fast, 30 minutes.
Okay. And Mr. Riley Smith?
Yes, thanks. I would say between 30 and 40 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. And Mr. Macklin?
Similar time as well.
Okay, that's fine. What I'm inclined to do is hear the first 2 closing submissions, then take a comfort break, and then we'll hear, obviously, from Mr. Macklin, who has the final right of reply. I'll mention it now so that I don't forget at the end, but should there be any applications for an award of costs, they need to be made once we've heard all the closing submissions. I will try and remember that at the end of the closings, but should there be any, and I don't mention them, please do wave at me. Okay. I think at that point, unless anyone's got any procedural questions.
My learner friend has his hand up.
So he has, sorry. It takes us back to the days of virtual inquiries and the very small hand that comes up in the corner. Yes, Mr. Riley Smith.
Yes, ladies, my apologies for raising the hand, and it's an unusual point which has just occurred. I received the appellant's closing, and of course I'm not allowed to respond to it. The appellant goes last, and in some ways it's beneficial to have it beforehand. I'm not going to moderate my closing in any way to deal with it, but scanning through it, I'm afraid to say there was one point raised in it which is rather inappropriate. And I didn't know whether was it where I sat on my hands until it was read out by Mr. Macklin, or I raise it now, and I thought it appropriate to raise it now. Now, sir, you may not have seen it, but at one point within the closing, Mr. Macklin makes a fairly serious allegation against a member of the Rule 6 party, which was never raised in evidence and is entirely unrelated to the appeal proposals. The allegation is in effect, they have done something without planning permission and should be enforced against, entirely on a separate site, nothing to do with the appeal side. Now, so for obvious reasons, first of all, if that point was even going to be raised, it would have to have been raised in evidence and I could take instructions on it. But also it's completely irrelevant to what you have to determine, but I hope so. You can see from my client's perspective, and I've not even been able to take instructions from them. It is damaging to have it in a public document that will be there. So it's unusual because I'd be making this point if it had been read out, but I've had sight of it beforehand. But I do have a concern as to one particular point in the appellant's closing.
Well, you're right. Thank you for that. Let's deal with it now. Obviously, I've not seen the point to date, but under normal circumstances, you would have seen it at this stage. But as you have, absolutely fine. Let's deal with it now. Let's deal with it now. I think without naming the person concerned. Mr. Macklin, you've heard the concerns from Mr. Riley Smith for the Rule 6. I mean, I've not read the comment that you have made, but the matter that what occurs to me immediately is the relevance of that, rightly or wrongly. I'm not making any judgment on that, but the relevance of an alleged breach of planning control elsewhere on the part of someone who's not the appellant, maybe a part of a Rule 6 party, but what's the relevance of that to this appeal?
I'm just going down reading it a second, but I'll be able to answer more concisely in a second.
Sure.
Page 10, the paragraph above the bold heading, the planning balance.
Yes. So I make reference to Mr. De Courcy, who in his evidence chose to use the words, the appellant has chosen to carry out significant works to the site prior to the quashing of the former appeal decision. These works are unauthorised and should this appeal be dismissed, will be no doubt be subject to enforcement action. And I replied to that, the words no doubt be subject to enforcement action are patently incorrect, as proven by multiple visits by the enforcement officer, and are defamatory. Of note with regards to the enforcement is that on Huckers Lane, so the same street we're speaking about, the most recent enforcement matter, other than the Queen's, has been that individual who we're speaking about, who built a house on Huckers Lane without seeking planning approval recently. I discussed the matter with the enforcement officer on one of his many visits to the Queen's. That's, in my view, that's context to this whole situation between our side and the Rule 6 side.
I think my start point is that at the inquiry, there was obviously discussion about the work, Mr. Macklin, that you'd done to the property. No question about that.
Yeah.
I'm obviously not looking at any enforcement appeal, even were there to be one. And I'll be corrected if I'm wrong. I don't think there was any suggestion from the local authority that there was any enforcement action being contemplated. I don't think that was the case. I'm going to shake the head.
I can confirm that. I can confirm that.
I mean, my position simply is that I'm dealing with the planning appeal, the rights and wrongs in planning terms of the proposal, and I mean, put bluntly, I haven't got any jurisdiction over any alleged enforcement. I obviously haven't got any jurisdiction over alleged enforcement at a different property. And I mean, put extremely clearly, I'm not really very interested in suggestions one way or t'other of enforcement matters. Now, Mr. Macklin, I understand what you're saying. You're responding to something that was in evidence. I think you said from Mr. De Courcy.
That's right. That's right. He made those comments in his evidence to us.
Was that? Sorry, I haven't got the evidence in front of me at the moment. Obviously, was that in written evidence or was that verbal?
It was in written evidence.
Mr. De Courcy. Sorry, just making a note here. I understand the concern, Mr. Riley Smith, that you've got on behalf of a member of the group. I don't think at the inquiry Well, let me put this as a question. At the inquiry, did we discuss that suggestion from Mr. De Courcy, or was it simply there? I don't know if you questioned it, Mr. Macklin.
So, and I suppose this is one of my concerns in relation to if that's the justification for it. I'm afraid I'm not. I was just fishing out Mr. De Courcy's proof to see whether those words occur in it, but let's say they do.
Yeah.
Firstly, of course, it's relating to the background to this site, which is more relevant than something happening on an entirely different site. I mean, that's I'd say a fairly fundamental principle. But secondly, so I do recall there being, certainly with this, the Macklin giving some evidence about enforcement officer visits, whether it be lawful or not.
Absolutely.
So that point was discussed and examined, and Mr. Macklin had a chance to raise it, and Mr. De Courcy had a chance to respond to, etc. This point, that this individual has carried out some sort of unauthorized development, well, it wasn't raised at all. In oral evidence by any member of the public, by Mr. Macklin himself, if this individual had been at the stand, they weren't asked any questions about it. So again, in many ways, I could let it lie because it's utterly irrelevant to what you've got to determine. But I can see on this individual's behalf, who's part of the group that I represent, to have it in a public document is damaging.
Yeah, Mr. Macklin, I've got quite a lot of sympathy with this. I mean, my start point is, as I said, that I'm really not very interested, put bluntly, in alleged enforcement matters at the appeal premises, and I'm even less interested in alleged enforcement matters at another property. I didn't, I have to say, pick up on, particularly on that comment at the inquiry itself, but there it is, that's out there. Mr. Macklin, it's not particularly helpful to have this in now, partly because, as I say, frankly, it's irrelevant to my decision, but also from the point of view of the way in which evidence should be presented. What you're about to give, and in passing, I've now seen your closing, I haven't read it, obviously, but what you're about to give is a summary, in effect, of the evidence that we heard at the inquiry. This particular point wasn't raised at the inquiry. Certainly the suggestion of unauthorised works at the appeal premises was raised, and I think, I'll be blunt about it, it was fairly firmly quashed, and I had a shake of the head from Mr. Mohammed saying that there wasn't any contemplation at this stage anyway by the authority to take action. I think when you go beyond that to make assertions which may be right, may be wrong about another person, another property, I can see that that person would be concerned, and in any event, it is way outside the procedure for closing submissions, which is what particularly concerns me. What's your view, Mr. Macklin?
Okay, so I was responding not to what was said at the closing, but collectively what I read in the evidence, and and also what I heard in the inquiry. So therefore, if I am not correct, because I've basically brought up a statement that was placed in written evidence as opposed to something that I could have tested in the room at the time, then I have to stand to be corrected from that position.
I'm not suggesting that. I mean, you're more than entitled in closing to raise any matters that were raised at the inquiry. And when I say raised at the inquiry, that includes matters raised in writing.
Okay.
But I don't think that the suggestion, which apparently is in your closing, about this individual doing unauthorised works elsewhere, I don't think that was raised at the inquiry.
No, that
was,
wasn't. That was okay. So
yeah, that's where we have a problem.
Okay.
In that closing submissions are just that. They're a summary of what we've heard, and all three parties will explain to me their view on what we've heard at the inquiry in writing and verbally. But when you then step outside of that and you introduce new matters that we haven't heard about or seen, then at that point, it's unfair on the other two parties, and I'd be saying this to them if they did it. It's unfair on the other two parties because they don't have a chance to respond to that.
Okay.
So my strong preference, Mr. Macklin, would be that you delete that comment from your reading of your closing, and I would be grateful if you could send in a revised, not immediately, but send in a revised version to PINS, omitting that particular statement that Mr. Riley-Smith was raising.
Okay, understood.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, thanks. I have now received, incidentally, your closing, Mr. Macklin, and the council's closing. So I've actually got electronic copies of all three. Okay, on that, shall we move straight to closings? Which, hang on, just trying to think of the order.
It's either me or Mr. Riley-Smith, so I'm happy to go first if he wishes.
Yes, I think probably it makes more sense for the local authority to go first, then Mr. Riley-Smith with all the six parties.
Absolutely fine.
And then Mr. Macklin, you always get the last word. So, okay, Mr. Mohammed, could you just bear with me 1 second?
Of course,
because
of course.
Having said that, I have your closing. I have yet to open it. Bear with me 1 second. Right, okay, and as I say, all three of you, if you do depart from the text, no problem, but just let me know so I can make a note. Mr. Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. These are the closing remarks on behalf of the Southdown National Park. Introduction and context. The site has a long history of coming to appeal, and it is critical to provide the inspector with a timeline of events leading up to this point. Pursuant to this, and in particular the key dates relating to this matter, sir, we've provided a chronology at the end of this document as an appendix in order to assist you. There have been 2 previous appeal decisions. This one will be the 3rd. The National Park Authority does not comment, nor does it need to rely upon the contributions made by the local community in the first day of the inquiry and in other sporadic parts of the inquiry. It was conceded by Mr. Macklin at the start of cross-examination by the National Park Authority that no substantive new evidence, updating matters or otherwise, has been provided to the inquiry since the quashing of the judgment, save for the statement for the appeal. The National Park Authority has confirmed that it does not dispute the principle of development at the Queen's Hotel, nor the uses sought, provided it is appropriate in scale, design, and policy terms. It is the National Park Authority's clear view that this scheme is promoted, does not work for this location. It is not difficult to sympathise with the appellant, Mr. Macklin, and his attempt to seek to redevelop the site, and the mistake of fact leading to his new inquiry. Notwithstanding this, one must not lose sight of the fact that this is not just a rural location in a conservation area where the landscape capacity of the site is limited. This is a nationally designated landscape with a statutory purpose to conserve and enhance the natural beauty, the wildlife, and the cultural heritage. You simply cannot develop here without these salient matters being at the forefront of your proposals. The National Park Authority does not wish to engage with a number of issues that is totally irrelevant to the substance of this appeal, including the viability of the Queen's, the long history prior to Mr. Macklin's purchase, local politics, land disputes, and whether the trees had to be felled. These may all be quite interesting, but they do not advance the case at hand. The position and history of the site, as agreed in the Statement of Common Ground, remains the same at the end of the inquiry. In terms of the footprint and what is being proposed, Mr. Macklin accepted that the measurements provided in Appendix 2 of Ms. Child's evidence is common ground. Finally, for context, Mr. Macklin also accepted in cross-examination that he does not provide any expertise beyond being very familiar with the site and its history. He accepted that when it came to the evidence of the National Park Authority, he was faced with 3 unchallenged experts in their field and his layman view. This was the balance sheet, ultimately, of the evidence. And crucially, Mr. Macklin was keen to deploy the "not my responsibility" defense whenever he found himself in a corner and missing answers. Turning to the substance of the evidence now, sir, the first issue is around the landscape strategy. The current design is not the best one, but it is better than nothing. And I quote directly Miss McGinney. Mrs. McGinney, someone who was supportive of Mr. Macklin, but wholly independent from him, gave a candid appraisal of what is being proposed. Her answer to this question captures all that is wrong with the proposal and how it cannot be fixed by what is proposed. In short, doing nothing is frankly the best option. In other words, dismissing the appeal and inviting the appellant to try again, utilizing all the contextual evidence available, is fundamentally the best route. Turning to the unchallenged evidence on landscape and character, we can conclude that the following from the evidence heard from Ms. Childs. First, there's no substantive evidence to support the baseline context as assessed by the appellant and in order to inform whether the current scheme is appropriate. We have no landscape expertise, input or analysis to support the proposals. There is therefore no demonstration that the scheme was or is landscape-led. Mr. Macklin accepted that it would be more desirable if the scheme were landscape-led. One must not again lose sight of why this landscape-led approach is crucial in a nationally designated landscape and the golden thread of the local plan. On the settlement and buildings, the scheme fails to accord with the pattern that contributes to the distinctiveness of Selborne, including the loss of building hierarchy or relationship with the surroundings and too much fenestration. On the spaces between these buildings, the removal of the garden space distorts the linear pattern of spaces relating to buildings, gardens, and the countryside and views out of it. The rural character will be lost due to the overdevelopment and the suburban interventions to be introduced. Mr. Macklin had no answer to the impacts from the bins and the bike stalls, the car park in the middle, the curbs, the pavements, the patios, and their individual as well as cumulative impacts. On the routes, there is a strong route hierarchy involving narrow, winding routes that retain the historic form and fabric within the village. This hierarchy will be undermined, with roads further into the site getting wider, concrete curbing and engineering dominating the distinct character, with secondary and tertiary routes widened and formalized. And finally, on vegetation, whatever the history in relation to the trees, lost mature trees have undermined the site's ability to screen the impacts. The context of Selborne remains the mature trees punctuate roofscape and provide backdrop to views. Of the trees that do remain, their associated space is lost, undermining the characteristic edge, namely a historic garden boundary. Indeed, the size and layout of the car park imposes itself rather than working to conserve and enhance the characteristics of the site and its context. This is simply not possible because of the overdevelopment there. Bringing these points together, we also learned the following from Mr. Macklin in cross-examination. Despite there being five different draft layouts provided for this proposal, the only meaningful change was to lose a room in one block. There was never any serious attempt to reduce the amount of development to fit with this site's true capacity. The Queen's is going to be significantly transformed, leading to overdevelopment. It is certainly not going to be conserved, let alone enhanced in accordance with the statutory purpose 1 of the national park. And in terms of the footprint, there is no dispute between the parties, accepting that the figures produced in Appendix 2 of Ms. Childs' evidence being the most accurate. Mr. Macklin did not seriously contest the simple point that the proposed Huckers Lane building risks competing with the main building and is far bigger than the existing extension to which it ought to be subservient. The answer given by Mr. Macklin, which is just not credible, is that whilst it may seem that way on paper and in 2D forms, the reality on the ground in 3D will present differently. There are also plenty of design criticisms made, to which there are, again, no answers, relating to the appropriateness of the domestic details of a structure that should read as an outbuilding to the main building. On the barn extension proposed, this would represent a 105% enlargement of the original barn footprint. Again, this is an agreed figure. This flies in the face of the design guide, key design principles, C 4.2. There are further concerns with the details provided not being in keeping with the area, including the roof lights, glazed connection, and how this relates to the conservation area. On the external space, it is plain as day that it will be transformed in a negative way. The car parking proposed will dominate the centre of the development. The 20 car parking spaces in the centre of the site are also said to be involving EV infrastructure, and yet the spacing is not a realistic representation of what this would look like on the ground. There are no disabled parking spaces being provided, and the gravel treatment on Plan 23 would also make it highly inaccessible. It is obvious to see just how cramped this development would be in these circumstances, meaning that it would be contrary to the community facilities that are expected to be accessible, inclusive, and available. All in all, it shows Mr. Macklin shirking responsibility to meet the disability requirements in his parking design, including no dropped curbs and a poor internal layout for anyone with mobility issues. The impact on the new access road onto Huckers Lane will also undoubtedly transform the character of this rural location. This access forms part of the long-distance public rights-of-way route of the Writers' Way, leading to the widening of the internal layout aimed at serving a total of 17 car parking spaces to the rear of the site. Incredibly, Mr. Macklin suggests that this is a modest change. As a general point, Mr. Macklin's not me gov defence on any challenge to his proposals was unedifying. It demonstrates a lack of ability to accept responsibility as a developer for this site, instead preferring to blame the National Park Authority for his totally misconceived proposals. Simply stating that the scheme was designed by committee is no defence for failing to procure landscape advice. This is particularly poor given the extra need to be more conscious in relation to a development in the national park. Instead, in reality, he used the authority's feedback as a tick box exercise instead of a genuine attempt at understanding the need to demonstrate compliance and acceptability. Frankly, to suggest that there would be a minimal interventions is similarly absurd. Taken together, all of the above issues, and in light of the conservation area and national park context, amounts to unacceptable harm in this location. In sum, this scheme will increase the footprint of various buildings in a way that's highly out of keeping with this part of Selborne. In external space that's dominated by either car parking and hard standing, if not by built form, the rural setting will be completely changed in this edge of countryside location in a conservation area where the character has a clear focus for the hierarchy of buildings and setting. Turning to the conservation area now, it is common ground that the local policy expects that any proposal must preserve or enhance the character and appearance of the Selborne Conservation Area. National Park Purpose 1 also aims to conserve and enhance natural beauty and cultural heritage, and national policy similarly expects great weight to be applied to those considerations, alongside legislation concerning conservation areas and national park purposes. Similar to his position on every other issue before this inquiry, Mr. Macklin offers no expert evidence on any of the issues raised, accepting that his evidence is not equal to, nor does it seek to contradict, the evidence of the National Park Authority. To this end, the following are the critical features of this scheme. First is the proposed scale again, including the non-subordinate design of the new buildings as discussed above, and built form generally is plainly cramped and crowded in form. The loss of open historic garden results in a more intensive form of development. The failure is not rescued by a previous inspector disagreeing. The issue of scale in relation to the barn, again, are not repeated here, but the scale and proportion are similarly not subordinate. And the impact of the extension, both in size and design features, all impact negatively on the conservation area. The domestic design features of the proposed apartment suites, I should say, my first typo, suites at paragraph 24, and roof lights on the southwest elevation of the barn do not respect the local character, nor seek to meet the high quality design expectation of the national park, contrary to national policy. SD5. In addition, the roof design of the proposed new apartment buildings should be gable ends, not hips, which is a more detailed and elevated design as opposed to a simple flat gable. The design features are overtly domesticated, overly large porches, split pane window, and French door located on the eastern flank end. This is plainly unacceptable. The complete loss of the historically significant garden space as an associated space with the Queen's is also harmful. Admittedly, this is a non-designated heritage asset, but it was also built this way in 1830, and this loss is to lead to irreparable and irreversible heritage harm. The scheme fails to conserve the cultural heritage of the site, again, not in accordance with the National Park's first purpose. The urbanizing features of the curbs along Hucker's Lane and along the track into the site would clearly harm the character of the conservation area. More thought could and should have gone into the design that was more sympathetic to the rural edge of the site, conscious of the real need to avoid urbanization from inappropriate curbs that would harm the country lane character, contrary to policy SD 15.1c. Cumulatively, the scheme proposed will have a negative and unacceptable impact on how this locally important non-designated heritage asset is appreciated, how the site is viewed from Hucker's Lane and the Selborne Conservation Area, and how the loss of the associated historic garden space and increased form of development will all have irreversible harm. To that end, the harm is quantified as less than substantial harm to the middle end, requiring that this scale of harm to be assessed against the NPPF paragraph 9. Finally, turning to the planning balance. Bringing all of this together, the planning context against which a balance must be reached is worth setting out. It is the National Parks Authority's view that there is no substantial compliance with the relevant local plan policies and the NPPF. In the first instance, there are national park considerations, most recently strengthened under Section 245 of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, which is a significant change since the scheme was quashed. It is worth repeating what is said in updating the duty to have regard to the purposes of national parks at paragraph 245. And I quote, "In exercising or performing any functions in relation to or so as to affect land in any national park in England, a relevant authority must seek to further the purposes. And if it appears that there is conflict between these purposes, you must attach greater weight to the purposes of conserving and enhancing the natural beauty, wildlife, and cultural heritage of the area comprised in the national park. End quote. The net effect of this new provision, adopted since the quashing of the previous decision, puts an extra onus on the national park and all public authorities, including the planning inspector as a decision maker, to be proactive, especially when it comes to a scheme such as this one failing to meet the first purpose. The conflict must be given significant and, in our view, determinative weight. The National Park Authority, again, to go back to the beginning, does not dispute the principle of development under SD 25 of the local plan, subject to the policies and the other policies and material considerations. SD 43 is the key policy against which to judge this development, particularly around the loss of community facilities and whether that is justified. These points have been addressed above, but where the development could reduce scope of community facility, the National Park Authority expects applicants to provide strong justification for the loss and or diminishment. For the reasons set out above, this scheme fails this test. The lack of any real evidence from the Gilbert White's museum is also quite telling, and only limited weight can be attached to what we are being told about their involvement and their interests. As to SD 43-2A, Mr. Macklin accepted that no marketing evidence has been provided. Whilst the lacking of marketing is not a fatal flaw as far as the National Park Authority is concerned, it does add to the multiple failures displayed by this proposal. Notwithstanding this, it is really SD 43-2C where the scheme's failure to meet policy is most stark. For the reasons set out above, it is not accessible or inclusive. Further, for the reasons heard, it cannot be seriously maintained that what is now proposed is either equivalent or better quality to what is lost. In this particular specific regard, the case by the National Park Authority's position is further supported by the evidence of the Rule 6 parties' evidence, and to that end, their evidence is not duplicated upon, as this will be fully covered in their closings, but to highlight the following for completion. In terms of the tap room, contrary to local policy, this will be less inclusive and appeal to a narrow demographic in the village. Mr. Macklin accepted this. It will also mean reduced hours, limited food and drink offering. The loss of the rear garden will mean the only amenity will be the tarmac area to the front. As to the Field Studies Centre, there is insufficient information and detail around how accessible or usable it will be. Community groups would have to work around the education provision that will clearly take precedent. We also heard evidence that it would cost the local community to hire the centre at a market rate. The lack of a Section 106 to tie this down, any of these details, means that there is little, if any, comfort the inspector can gain from mere assertions by Mr. Macklin. In relation to the accommodation, this will be privately managed with an emphasis on catering to wedding market, most likely in conjunction with the Gilbert and White Museum, which will, whilst seasonal, will have the effect of reducing provision for other visitors. On the community shop element of the proposals, it is not contained in the description of development, and its delivery is at best mere ambition. There are no floor plans to support its location, and following the questions from the inspector, the suggestion that this could be applied into the reality on the ground is at best sceptical proposition. In connecting these strings together, whilst the proposals seek to repurpose the Queens, this will not meet SD 43-2C for all the reasons set out. There are no other material consideration that could be relied upon to temper this failure to meet local policy in full. There are no public benefits or other material considerations that could outweigh the conflict with the development plan. National Park Purpose 1 must be given great weight in line with national policy in order to conserve and enhance the landscape and scenic beauty and cultural heritage of the national park. This is a heavy consideration, weighing against the proposal. And in conclusion, sir, for all the reasons that I've just set out and the reasons contained in the evidence presented before you on behalf of the National Park Authority, we invite you to dismiss this appeal. So you'll see, I won't read out, but 2 more pages of a timeline that hopefully is common ground and gives you a sort of detailed dates and references to give you an idea of what's been happening between 2016 to today.
Right, right. Thank you for that, Mr. Mohammed. Mr. Riley Smith, if we can move straight over to you just before we do, to confirm that I've now received Mr. Macklin's slightly amended proof dealing with that matter that we discussed earlier. Thanks very much for that, Mr. Macklin. So, Mr. Riley Smith, over to you.
Yes, thank you, sir. I will stick to script and indicate if at any point I depart from it, although I'm not intending to. In opening, Save the Queen's identified 3 overarching issues with the appeal proposal, which we submit justify permission being refused and the appeal being dismissed. The closing will adopt the same structure, although the wider context should not be lost sight of. Namely, that this is, in planning terms, a clearly inappropriate proposal that runs contrary to a whole suite of policies in the development plan and would be contrary to the purpose of the national park itself. In real-world terms, this planning conflict would translate to a proposal that is bad for the village, the community, and visitors. This is why Save the Queens have gone to the lengths they have to resist the appeal. The first, reflecting the authority's reason for refusal 1 issue, is the appeal proposal's conflict with policy SD 43. It's important to first understand, for the purposes of SD 43, the baseline and what we're comparing it with. The baseline is the Queen's when it last operated as a public house with serviced rooms before it was shut down by the appellant shortly after they purchased it. This was when the Queen's was open 7 days a week, serving breakfast, lunch and dinner, and was made up of a main bar, a smaller bar, and a restaurant function room which could seat 60 people and was served by the commercial kitchen next door. The Queen's had a sizable pub garden and had up to 7 serviced inn-like rooms, i.e., because that's is a term you'll be hearing a bit in this closing, a bedroom and ensuite, but meals provided by the pub. The function room can be used for free by residents throughout the week and was used for birthdays, weddings, wakes, quizzes and political party meetings, just to name a few. Such events could be fully catered by the adjoining commercial kitchen and rely on the bars to provide drinks. This baseline was established by the factual and unchallenged evidence of Dr. Rye and Mrs. Palmer, as well as by the numerous residents who came to speak in opposition to the appeal proposal throughout the inquiry. It was accepted by Mr. Macklin, herein referred to by initials GN, that Save the Queen's had more experience of how the Queen's previously operated compared to him, and he did not dispute the evidence as to how it operated. In that context, his last-minute attempt to blithely describe the state of the function room as run down in cross-examination should be entirely disregarded. The baseline must be compared to the appeal proposal, but this is where the inquiry runs into difficulty. The difficulty arises out of the unusual vagueness with which the appeal proposals were presented by the appellant, a lack of clarity that ran throughout their entire case. Will the appeal proposal include a field study centre to be used by the Gilbert White Museum? It's unclear, given the appellant did not formally call anyone from the museum to give evidence. While Mr. Aziz, the chair of the trustees, appeared as a member of the public to support the proposal on the first day, his evidence was not adopted by the appellant. Although, if the appellant falls back on comments from Mr. Aziz, that does not help the inquiry understand how the scheme will benefit the museum and for how long, given Mr. Macklin accepted that there was no planning obligation tying the museum to the appeal proposal, and that the museum would have to enter into a new lease with them if permission was granted. Furthermore, he accepted there was nothing stopping them entering a commercial arrangement with another operator. This leaves the Rule 6 party and you, sir, in a difficult position. How do we assess the impacts of a museum-run field study centre which may never occur if permission is granted? As set out by Mr. de Courcy in Examination in Chief, the appropriate approach is to use Mr. Aziz's information as the best explanation we have as to the intended use in terms of assessing the impacts. The reason being that it's common sense that the appellant is going to want to produce their best case possible with the least negative impacts, and so we're entitled to scrutinise it on that basis. But equally, in terms of the purported planning benefits that arise from the involvement of the museum, it means those benefits can only carry minimal weight given the lack of formal involvement of the museum with the appeal proposals. And the day after the appeal was won, on the basis of their involvement, the appellant could turn the Field Study Centre into a law court. There is nothing which secures the purported benefits of the museum to the appeal proposal. Continuing the topic of uncertainty, it is uncertain and vague as to the hours the tap room will operate. We know it's currently only open 5:30 to 9 Thursday to Saturday, but what's the appellant proposing to do in the future? When asked directly in cross-examination, Mr. Macklin did not answer at first, claiming it was not for him to decide. When pressed, he eventually relied on the aim of opening noon to 11 p.m. 7 days a week to reflect their granted licence. But he also accepted that this would be based purely on commercial demand. In this respect, Mr. Earney confirmed in cross-examination that the tap room was, as a commercial venture to maximise profits for the museum, only open at the existing limited hours as they were the peak times with the most demand, and there was no evidence that they would want to run it 7 days a week. In light of this evidence, and the lack of clarity from Mr. Macklin, you, sir, cannot have any confidence that the tap room will be run for more than its current operational hours. Equally uncertain was the appellant's proposals for the accommodation. At times we were told it was proposed to be run by the museum, although again they're not tied to the appeal proposal, primarily as part of their wedding venue business as set out by Mr. Aziz. But this was then contradicted by Mr. Macklin, who claimed that it would be for mini breaks and eventually clarified, contrary to his adoption of Savile's appeal statement in his examination in chief, that it would be available for between 1 to 60 days. All this uncertainty significantly undermines the appellant's case. But for the purposes of identifying the appeal proposal which should be compared to the baseline, the Rule 6 party would say it is the following. Firstly, a tap room which is open 3 days a week for 3.5 hours, serving a limited range of museum beers, along with wine and serving no hot meals. This was aptly described as niche by Mrs. Palmer, which was accepted by Mr. Macklin on the basis that the tap room would serve to, quote, a narrower market. Secondly, a field study centre which would be used as an educational facility associated with the museum to provide educational courses to adults or offer courses for older children from a 30-mile radius, with an example given of Portsmouth. This use would be in both the day and evening, but there would be theoretical scope for the ad hoc use of the space by residents when it was not being used by the museum. This would not be catered, given there's no commercial kitchens that had been demolished, and there would be a fee for using it. Although Mr. Aziz claimed it was, to quote, below his pay grade to know what that would be, he was clear that the museum would have to maximise profit from it. And the inquiry had evidence from Miss Sale that the current field study centre at the museum was rented out for £1,000 a time, raised from 300 to increase value. Thirdly, 5 self-catering apartments which are laid out with kitchens, bathrooms and living spaces sufficient to meet the space standards for residential C3 flats. They'll be rented out by individuals for up to 60 nights. Fourth, it does not include a community shop or any other shop, given such a use is not within the description of development, not shown on any plans, and is, according to the Selborne Stores Limited who aim to run such a shop, not appropriate for it. The fact that Mr. Macklin continued to press ahead with the assurance that it did, despite these numerous fatal flaws, starkly reflects the need to try and increase the appeal proposal benefits by hook or by crook. Having set out the baseline on the appeal proposal, we turn to consider the terms of policy SD 43. The appellant is relying on SD 43.2c, which will be examined in detail in a moment. But before doing so, it's important not to lose sight of what the appellant is not relying upon in SD 43, SD 43.2a. The appellant, throughout their evidence, has on numerous occasions and in numerous places wrongly described the Queen's as an unviable venture, while raising the spectre of it sitting as a redundant building unless the appeal proposal is granted permission. However, that argument is untenable given the decision not to produce evidence and seek to comply with the relevant part of SD 43, which allows such an argument to justify redevelopment, i.e. 2A. SD 43.2a clearly sets out the policy route for arguing that the existing community facility is unviable, namely carrying out 24 months of robust marketing showing there's no market demand. The appellant has not done that or sought to have done it. The last time they attempted such an argument, Inspector Edwards found their case lacked substantive evidence and that it could not be concluded based on a flawed previous marketing campaign that the Queen's was no longer viable. Mr. Macklin confirmed in cross-examination that he had not produced any evidence since then as to the viability of the Queen's, nor carried out any further marketing, nor put the site back on the market. In light of that, he rightly conceded that the unviability of the pub was supposition which you, sir, should disregard. This is also reflected in Mr. de Courcy's view given in examination in chief that there was no evidence on which you, sir, could conclude the Queen's was previously unviable and redundant. That should be the end of the appellant's allusions and the spectre of a redundant building. Turning to the elements of SD 43.2 which the appellant does rely on, and as set out by Mr. de Courcy and agreed by Mr. Macklin, there are three elements to 2C which must be met to accord with policy. First, the new facility must be accessible, inclusive and available. Second, the new facility must be equivalent or better quality to the facility that was lost. And third, it must not cause an unreasonable reduction or shortfall in the local service provision. In terms of the first element, Mr. de Courcy set out that the relevant group to whom the new facility must be accessible, inclusive and available to is the local community, i.e. the residents of Selborne and the surrounding area. And the inquiry heard compelling evidence from residents as to why they did not find the appeal proposal met this requirement. In terms of inclusivity, Mrs. Palmer noted, having been a regular user of the Queen's for a variety of purposes, the niche beer-centric offering of the tap room had no attraction for her. In terms of accessibility and availability, the tap room is only open for reduced hours and the Field Studies Centre is primarily to provide a wider educational services to people coming from across the country. It is fundamentally not a community facility for residents. A point starkly illustrated by the fact that their use of the Field Studies Centre will be on an ad hoc basis when it's not used by the museum and available for a price that could be £1,000 on the evidence we've heard. The appeal proposal is clearly not accessible, inclusive and available to the local community, and nor is it meant to be. This is why Mr. Macklin had to concede in cross-examination that this element of 2C was not met. In terms of the second element, this requires you, sir, to compare the community facility that's been lost against the new facility being provided to see if they're of equivalent or better quality. The tap room cannot be said to be equivalent or better quality. First typo there, sir. Oh, no, probably not, actually. I don't think it does need equality. I'll start again at paragraph 26. The tap room cannot be said to be equivalent or better than, it is a typo, rather than that, sir, I think on 26 line 1, it should read than. The tap room cannot be said to be equivalent or better than the public house element of the Queen's, given its limited opening hours, its narrow and niche offering, and the fact it does not serve hot food. Nor can the Field Study Centre, given previously the function room, provided residents with a flexible, catered, licensed and free-to-hire function space, which the inquiry has heard was used by residents for a whole variety of occasions. The best the appellant can offer to replace this with is a promise of ad hoc use of an uncatered space for a fee when it isn't being used by the museum. As Mr. Macklin eventually was forced to concede in cross-examination, that cannot be said to be equivalent or better. Equally, as will be expanded upon under the third overarching issue, the replacement of 7 serviced-in rooms with 5 self-catered apartments is taking away more of the type of accommodation Selborne needs in return for less of what it doesn't need. Overall, as partially accepted by Mr. Macklin and as set out by Mr. de Courcy, the second element of SD 43 is also not met. The third element requires the appellant to show that without the Queens, there will not be an unreasonable reduction or shortfall in public houses with serviced-in rooms. Even at this high level, as Mr. Macklin conceded, this is not met as there are no other pubs with serviced-in rooms within Selborne. However, diving deeper into the policy requirements as set out by Mr. de Courcy in examination in chief, Section 4 of Appendix 3 of the Development Plan sets out that a developer will be required to carry out an assessment of the needs of the local community to show the existing premises is not needed and that adequate alternative provision is available. Mr. Macklin accepted he had not done this. Furthermore, 4.2 makes clear that it will not be sufficient to just point to the presence of another facility in the same category to meet the third element of 2C. While there are no other pubs with serviced rooms, this also discounts any reliance the appellant may have placed on the Selborne Arms. Although you, sir, also have the evidence of residents that the Queens and the Selborne Arms catered for different needs in the village, with the latter a traditional cosy village pub with no function space, a difference recognised by Inspector Edwards in 2019. Again, the appellant has blithely ignored this third element, and there is no persuasive evidence that they've presented to meet it nor respond to the compelling evidence of residents and Save the Queens. Coupled with the failure to follow the clear requirements set out in the supporting text at Section 4 of Appendix 3, the appellant must fail this third element. Therefore, looking at SD 43-2C as a whole, the appeal proposal conflicts with all 3 elements. It looks to replace a much-loved, multi-purpose, heart-of-the-community public house with service rooms, with a niche tap room, educational space and longer-stay apartments. This is exactly the type of inappropriate development that SD 43-2C is seeking to guard against, and the conflict with this most important policy justifies refusal on its own. Turning to issue 2, which is the overdevelopment of the site, contrary to the National Park, landscape and heritage policies. The inquiry has heard evidence from both Mr. de Courcy and the authority's heritage and landscape experts, which will not be repeated here. However, it is worth reiterating 2 points that came out of Save the Queen's evidence and their cross-examination of the appellant. The first is the failure of the appeal proposal to accord with the village design statement. While this is a recent version, that does not negate the need to consider the appeal proposal against it, and for the appeal proposal to reflect and accord with the principles contained within. As Mr. de Courcy set out in examination in chief, the village design statement identifies the distinct linear form of the village and its relationship with its landscape setting. Selborne is, to quote, unusually well conserved and highly sensitive to change. Part of this distinct form are the lanes within the village which give a rural feel as they branch off the high street. One of these is Hucker's Lane, which is highlighted in the village design statement as being particularly important to conserve and enhance due to it being the first stretch of the ancient Via Canonicorum. However, the appeal proposal will erode this rural character by placing a dominating prominent building, the accommodation block, adjoining Hucker's Lane and replacing the hedge that currently runs along it with a reduced replacement squeezed into the narrow space between the block and the road. This, coupled with the expansion of the alternation and curbing, would further harm and erode the current character of Hucker's Lane. The appeal proposal is doing the very opposite of conserving and enhancing the village as required in the village design statement. This touches upon the second point. The overdeveloped nature of the site is a concern seemingly shared by the appellant's own witness. During cross-examination of Mrs. McGenny, she confirmed that she shared Save the Queen's and the authorities' concerns that the current proposal was overdevelopment of the site and that she would have preferred to see the demolished kitchens rebuilt to accommodate the additional units. In her words, "I don't think the current design proposal is the best one." This reflects what Save the Queen's would say is crystal clear. The appeal proposal would fill a spacious green pub garden with parking and a large uncharacteristic extension, and has already removed the mature belt of trees which previously were relied upon to partly mitigate this unacceptable impact. It is a quintessential example of overdevelopment, and one which runs contrary to the spectrum of policies adopted to protect the national park, the landscape character of the area, and the historic environment. Turning to issue 3, which is sustainable tourism. Before turning to how the appeal proposal would conflict with SD23 sustainable tourism, it's important to deal with the preliminary point of the proper categorisation of the accommodation provided. As set out by Mr. de Courcy, while the proposals describe the self-catering apartments as apart suite hotels, can I just check, is the inspector still with us?
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Riley Smith. Looks like the inspector, it's Richard, it looks like we've lost the inspector.
Yes, I just saw that.
We'll maybe give him 30 seconds or a minute to see if he logs back in.
Right. Good afternoon again. I suspect the problem's at my end, which is unfortunate. Mr. Riley Smith, I lost you, or you probably lost me, at paragraph 39, beginning of.
Right.
Sorry
so
about that.
Not at all. I'll start again at 39.
Thank you very much.
This touches upon the second point, that the overdeveloped nature of the site is a concern seemingly shared by the appellant's own witness. During cross-examination of Miss McGenney, she confirmed that she shared Save the Queen's and the authorities' concerns that the current proposal was overdevelopment of the site, and she would have preferred to see the demolished kitchens rebuilt to accommodate the additional units. In her words, to quote, "I don't think the current design proposal is the best one." This reflects what Save the Queen's would say is crystal clear. The appeal proposal would fill a spacious, green pub garden with parking and a large uncharacteristic extension, and has already removed the mature belt of trees which previously were relied upon to partly mitigate this unacceptable impact. It is a quintessential example of overdevelopment, and one which runs contrary to the spectrum of policies adopted to protect the national park, the landscape character of the area, and the historic environment. Turning to issue 3, which is sustainable tourism. Before turning to how the appeal proposal would conflict with SD23 sustainable tourism, it's important to deal with the preliminary point of the proper categorisation of the accommodation provided. As set out by Mr. Corsi, while the proposal describes the self-catering apartment as apart hotel suites, in reality, they can currently be more properly characterised as C3 residential flats. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is the physical layout. These apartments are laid out to provide all the facilities required for day-to-day domestic existence: living spaces, kitchens, bedrooms and bathrooms. This points to a domestic dwelling house use. In fact, Mr. Corsi noted in examination in chief that they reflect the minimum nationally described space standards for residential flats. The second is on the current use. Given the appellant has decided to move forward with altering the site to already provide some of the apartments, the inquiry has some indication as how they can be used. The 3 available units have not been used by the museum to provide short-term holiday accommodation, but instead 2 of them have been at times rented out for longer-term stays, or for long-term stays. This is including assisting someone whose house was flooded, and most strikingly of all, it was revealed during the inquiry that the top floor of the Queen's has been turned from a manager's flat and 2 serviced letting rooms into 1 suite, which has been occupied by a pro golfer for the last year. That is a far cry from the previous or sought use. The physical layout of the suites, coupled with the current use, clearly shows that the proposed apartments can and currently are being used for a use more akin to C3 than C1. Well, sir, to answer your question you asked in the inquiry, why is this relevant? As you rightly noted, you don't have the power to amend the description of development, and they're described as being apart hotel suites. The relevance of Save the Queen's raising this point is twofold. Firstly, it's part of the justification for the 3 additional conditions that Save the Queen's have put forward if the appeal were allowed, all aimed at restriction and controlling the use to being C1. As set out in the previous submissions of Mr. de Courcy, our C3 arguments illustrate how easily the appellant could use the apartments for a C3 use, and the setting out of clear parameters and controls through additional conditions allows the council, so that should be the authority, to properly control the use of apartments. Secondly, it highlights the stark difference between what was previously provided by the Queen's and what would be provided by the appeal proposal. The previous 7 serviced-in rooms could never be C3, given they do not have all the facilities required for day-to-day domestic existence. They fall squarely into the C1 category. The fact that the proposed apartments could so easily be C3 helps to illustrate the significant shift in the nature and type of tourist accommodation being proposed, and this is what leads us onto the ways in which the appeal proposal breaches SD23. Part 2 of policy SD23 requires that any development proposals which result in a loss of visitor accommodation are resisted unless unviability has been proved and marketing carried out. Given the appellant has not done so, if the appeal proposals would result in the loss of visitor accommodation, then it will be in conflict with SD23. As set out by Save the Queens, the loss of visitor accommodation here comes from the loss of 7 much needed serviced in rooms to be replaced with only 5 self-catering apartments. As well as being a quantitative loss, it is a qualitative one, which emerges from the change in the nature of the tourist accommodation offered. As Mr. de Courcy Mr. de Courcy in examination in chief set out, how the previous serviced-in type rooms catered for a shorter term stay, while self-catering apartments catered for a longer term stay. This is reflected in the visitor accommodation review, referenced in the supporting text to SD23 at paragraph 650 and 661, at 4.2.1, which noted that both the key market for the South Downs was people coming for short breaks, and that people coming for longer holidays were a key market for self-catering accommodation, but of, to quote, less or no importance to in-pub accommodation. The reason being, as Dr. Rye explained in her examination in chief, that there is a significant demand in both the National Park and Selborne for short-term weekend break accommodation. This fits with the desire of visitors who wish to spend a few days in Selborne visiting the museum and walking the surrounding countryside. For these types of visitors, the provision of serviced accommodation is a key attraction. It is also provided a particular benefit to residents who could have put up guests at the Queen's, one example being Mrs. Palmer's use of the Queen's to host guests for her daughter's wedding. While Mr. Macklin did not accept the proposition that serviced rooms were suitable for shorter-term breaks and self-catering apartments for longer-term breaks, he did accept that it's important to have a mix of tourist accommodation, self-catering, caravans, hotels, inns, etc. On either Mr. de Courcy's proposition, i.e. the importance of short-term accommodation, or Mr. Macklin's, i.e. the importance of a mix, the evidence suggests that the appeal scheme would contradict both of these aims. From a park-wide perspective, the visitor accommodation review sets out how across the national park there are 3 times as many self-catering apartments than inns. While from a local perspective, as shown by the analysis at Appendix 4 of Mr. de Courcy's proof, there are now only self-catering apartments in Selborne with no serviced inns. To find the nearest serviced in rooms, you'd have to go 2.6 miles to Hawkley and then 3.6 miles to the Three Horseshoes, after which there are none until 5 miles away. In the same distance, there are 16 self-catering apartments. That cannot be said to reflect the mix of tourist accommodation that Mr. Macklin placed importance on. The point is that the National Park and Selborne have lots of self-catering apartments and limited amounts of serviced rooms, while conversely, there is a particular demand for short-term accommodation, which is the key market for the South Downs. The appeal proposals would take away from the most needed type of accommodation, for which there is the least amount, and provide in its place a type of accommodation which is already over-catered for in the area. This is the antithesis of sustainable tourism, and illustrates why the appeal proposals would not only result in a quantitative but a qualitative loss in tourist accommodation, thus creating a conflict with SD23 Part 2. There's also a breach of Part 1 of SD23, and in particular D, to quote, development proposals must make use of existing buildings and, if no suitable existing buildings are available, the design of any new buildings are sensitive to character and setting. While the second part of D is likely breached by the issues raised under issue 2, there are 2 standalone breaches of the first part. The appeal proposal includes extending an existing barn to create a residential property, as well as the new apartment building to contain the 2 additional apartment suites that could not be fitted in the Queen's. Mr. Macklin accepted that it was technically possible to use the barn to house the 2 additional accommodation suites and avoid building the accommodation extension. So why didn't he? No clear answer was given. Instead, there was a hard-to-follow reliance on the provision of a disability-accessible lift in the main Queen's. And that lack of explanation brings the appellant into further conflict with 1D. In effect, the appellant has expanded the built form and overdeveloped the site to provide additional tourist accommodation, which he could have provided instead of the residential dwelling. 1D is further breached by Mr. Macklin's acceptance of the straightforward but striking point that if he had kept to providing serviced rooms instead of self-catering apartments, then he would not have needed the extension, but could have kept all the accommodation in the existing Queen's. Not only has the appellant swapped needed accommodation for less needed accommodation, but they've been forced to overdevelop the site to provide it. A further conflict with 1D. Overall, the appeal proposal would conflict with ST23, which adds a further development plan breach beyond the reasons for refusal. The point is well illustrated by the Visitor Accommodation Review, which notes in their recommendation for forward action that the wider rationale for supporting the development of visitor accommodation is that it provides opportunities to quote, keep village and country pubs open and viable, maintaining them as a resource for local communities. While it is at risk of stating the obvious, this appeal proposal does the direct opposite. Turning then to conclusion. The appellant has suggested throughout this appeal that there is a silent majority of the village who are in support of his proposal and sought to paint Save the Queen's as being just, to quote, the privileged few who've taken a particular dislike to the appellant. As set out by Dr. Rye, this couldn't be further from the truth, but it's perhaps appropriate to therefore end by reference not to Save the Queen's formal evidence, but by the heartfelt, honest evidence of the residents who came to speak as members of the public. The picture they paint of the Queen's is that of a well-used and well-cherished community facility whose loss is sorely felt. It was what drew Lara Roberts and her husband to Selborne. It exhibited Roderick James's wife's paintings. It lubricated Sir Adrian Montague's wedding guests prior to the wedding. Its ability to, quote, accommodate larger groups in a single room, creating a communal, cohesive atmosphere, was treasured by Matthew Turner. And it was, to quote, a genuine community hub and fulfilled a genuine community need for Lynn Ravenscroft. It was, in other words, a village pub, one which fed, intoxicated, entertained, consoled, accommodated, and brought together the residents and the community of Selborne. It was the type of community facility which policy SD43 was designed to protect, and whose breach would lead to the residents being left with the commercially run niche tap room and educational space alongside long-term holiday rental apartments. This is undeniably, as Mr. Macklin accepted, a different and poorer type of community facility, and one that comes at a high heritage and landscape cost due to overdevelopment and a sustainable tourism cost due to the loss of serviced rooms. While the intentions and motives of Save the Queen's are not strictly relevant to the planning merits under consideration at this appeal, they are important to contextualising the stance that Save the Queen's has taken, and in responding to some of the criticism made by the appellant. Save the Queen's stance is not one of nostalgically looking to the past glories of the Queen's. It's looking to the future, and what the Queen's can be again once this appeal is dismissed. It is about ensuring a significant hospitality asset, which was a destination in its own right, continues to function in the centre of Selborne, attracting both residents and visitors to the ongoing life of the community and its businesses, which of course include the museum. Ms. McGenney asked what policies the appeal proposal breached. Well, as set out by Mr. de Courcy, it breaches SD4, SD5, SD12, SD15, SD23 and SD43 of the South Downs local plan. But this can perhaps be summarised even more succinctly by Dr. Rye, who said, to quote, "This development deprives the community of the facilities we've previously enjoyed for socialising, meeting and celebrating, without replacing this loss with adequate alternatives. It also removes suitable and appropriately scaled visitor accommodation and requires harmful and unnecessary development in the centre of our attractive historic village. On that basis, sir, you are respectfully requested to refuse permission and dismiss the appeal, and unless I can assist any further, those would be the Rule 6 parties' closing submissions."
Thank you very much, Mr. Riley-Smith. Let's take a break now. Just before we do so, Mr. Macklin, you've obviously heard the closing submissions of the other two parties in opposition to your position. You've got excuse me, you've got a closing submission which I obviously haven't read yet. You may find it useful, entirely up to you, to simply say, well, I've covered all the points that the other two parties have made, or they're obviously not introducing new points, but before you start your written text, you might want to say, well, there's an additional point that was raised, not a new point, but an additional point raised by one of the other parties. I'll deal with it now. But as I say, I'm not hinting either way. You may feel that you've covered everything that that you've heard in opposition to you, but you can obviously use that break to think where you'd like to go. I now have the time at call it past. Let's resume in a quarter of an hour at 15:45. I suggest, ironic that I suggest this, but I suggest so that you don't drop off Teams, that you mute your microphone, turn the camera off, and then stay on Teams for the moment. And I will hopefully do the same, and we'll come back in a quarter of an hour. Thanks.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, can do indeed, Mr. Macklin. We've got Mr. Mohammed back, and hopefully Mr. Riley Smith. Quite. Yes, and we've got Mr. Riley Smith back. Okay, Mr. Macklin, I've obviously got your slightly amended closing statement, so over to you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to pick up on one initial point before I go into my closing statement. And if you turn to Appendix 2 on my closing statement, there's a CGI visual labelled 5.6 under Design Proposals, which was essentially, that was the submitted plan back in September of 2020. And I just want to make reference to that, which you'll see in my closing statements I refer back to. But Miss McGenney, this was the proposal that both her and many other people in the village had, shall we say, supported with essentially they felt that this was the best use of the site in terms of design, layout, gardens, parking, etc., etc. So this is where we started this process when we submitted the application. And so to answer Mr. Mohammed saying, questioning that we haven't ended up with the best proposal, our view is that this proposal was the best, but due to the term planning by committee, the consultees, shall we say, forced design changes upon us through the process. So that is why we've ended up where we are today with the design that we're obviously making a decision on today. Which I just would like to sort of highlight that, because there's obviously been quite a lot of discussion between various parties on that subject.
Thank you.
Okay. So just bear with me a second, sir. I'll just get to the start of my
It's fine. Just
be a moment. Right, so good afternoon. It must be understood that the redevelopment of the Queen's has been designed to create a sustainable future. That was not the case, in our view, prior to ownership. Otherwise, the tenants wouldn't have failed and the brewery wouldn't have sold the premises. This sustainable proposal, of which a good proportion of this is now operational and profitable, needs just completion for the benefit of the community, the local authority, the Gilbert White House, and our company. This application was designed from the ground up in 2020 with input from the CEO and head of planning of the SDMP in discussion with the Gilbert White House. Our application came forward with a range of uses principally led by these discussions, as stated in the submission by the chairman of the trustees of the Gilbert White House. The Gilbert White House applied for grant funding from the SDMP for the tap room, evidence from the ex-Gilbert White director's statement to this inquiry, and the case officer, who was according to Mr. Ferguson's evidence, guided us through many different design iterations to end up with the plans in front of you today, Inspector. As we've heard from Mr. Ferguson's cross-examination on how the officer's recommendation works, we question whether it is realistic that a temporary case officer making a recommendation to a planning committee would have been under very close supervision and guidance from those more senior. For clarity of the proposal, as there have been a few moments of clarification required during this inquiry, the tap room on the drawings, as you've seen, sir, from the from your site visit, essentially has a tap room at the front, it has a kitchen in the middle, and it has a storeroom at the rear, which could be opened as a shop, as it has front door access to the car park. The field study centre on the drawings is a multi-use space, with principal use being the field study centre. The apart hotel suites 1 to 5 on the drawings is obviously the visitor accommodation, and finally the barn is the proposed residential house. We believe, following the site inspection with you, Inspector, it didn't require imagination to see these uses within the site and how they could work together. A summary of addressing the two reasons for refusal: SD 43, community facility provision and the overdevelopment in the conservation area. So turning to SD 43. SD 43 allows for the provision of alternative community facilities that are inclusive, available, accessible, or of equivalent or better quality and do not cause an unreasonable shortfall. Now, our case officer, CD12 Committee Report September 21, said objectors are particularly concerned about the loss of the public house. However, the uses of this space will be more wide-ranging and the benefits felt by the local community will be multifaceted. During the application process, officers requested to see sight of a business plan. The plan highlights that the Queens will become a community hub offering benefits to a wider demographic within the local community. Officers consider the plans a practical tie-up of use by the GWM, that being the Gilbert White Museum, whilst incorporating benefits for the wider community. So turning to R. Savills CD final rebuttals on SD43, policy SD43 does not require a like-for-like replacement to do so. The appeal is designed to meet a demonstrable need within the village and the national park, and to be truly complementary to the existing businesses within the village and deliver a valuable resource for the local community. Supporting paragraph 7.226 to policy SD 43 states both larger settlements and rural communities. Community infrastructure facilities enable essential public services to be provided as locally as possible, and as such, there is a presumption that they should be retained or replaced with proposals of at least an equivalent standard. Appropriate size proposals which would provide inclusive shared services through the joint use of facilities in accessible locations will be supported in principle. The final sentence of paragraph 7.226 is central to the consideration of this appeal. The appeal site will become a shared community hub offering multiple benefits to a much wider demographic within the local community. The range and flexibility of uses offered will far eclipse the previous use and should be supported as a matter of principle. In their consultee comments, CD 15 Appendix 8, the SDMPA policy officer states that in practice, that should be, sorry, I'll just update that. In practice, community facilities may be a combination of different types on a continuum between community and private functions. Turning to Inspector Shearing at the previous appeal decision 22 reference CD 20, she remarks the appeal scheme includes a provision of a space intended for the Gilbert White Museum Field Study Centre and the creation of a tap room. The Field Study Centre would provide a classroom facility and a space available for hire during evenings, weekends, school holidays, and for a variety of purposes. The tap room could include a community shop. The proposed uses fall within the list of community infrastructure facilities given at paragraph 7.227 of the SDLP as part of the supporting text to SD 43. And as such, they constitute appropriate alternative uses as supported by the policy. The proposed new community facilities would be situated on the ground floor of the main Queen's building, where they'd engage with and contribute to the vibrancy of the high street. They would utilise the existing main entrance on the side of the building, as well as an entrance to the front of the building, and would include toilet facilities on the same level. Car parking, car and cycle parking spaces will be provided on site for the use of future visitors. For these reasons, the facilities would be accessible, inclusive, and available in their physical attributes. Based on the evidence and findings on my site visit, the proposal would not cause an unreasonable reduction or shortfall in the local provision. In line with policy SD 43, it therefore falls to be considered whether the alternative facilities proposed would be equivalent or better than those lost. She goes on, I note the authority's concerns that the proposed operating hours of the tap room, together with its food and drink offer and lack of garden area, would be notably different than those of the former public house, but consequently the services to the local community would undoubtedly differ. However, these factors taken together would not necessarily result in a use which could not be of equivalent quality or better, when considered in combination with the other facilities proposed, in particular the Field Study Centre, which has the potential to serve a wider and more diverse section of the local community. The proposed development could also provide a high quality and valued facility. The letting of the Field Study Centre for other uses by the community, including functions and exercise classes, would depend on the premises being let at a reasonable rate to those community groups. However, this is not a unique circumstance, and I understand the former public house was also a commercially led enterprise. I have no evidence or reason to control the rates or place such a burden on the development. Similarly, it would not pass the test of reasonableness to restrict the geographical area of future users of the Field Study Centre to prevent its use by people outside the village. While there may be a degree of competition between the proposed facilities and those in the village, it's not the role of the planning system to restrict competition. Furthermore, I acknowledge that there are a great many factors relating to the specific management and ownership of the site which could impact its integration with the local community. However, it's not for the planning process to control or unduly restrict the proposed use by conditions beyond what is necessary and relevant to planning. The proposed community uses would be accessible, inclusive and available, and I have no reason to believe that together they would not provide an equivalent or better quality of facility to that lost, albeit through providing different services to the former public house. Neither would the proposal cause an unreasonable reduction or shortfall in the local service provision. Consequently, the appeal scheme would comply with SD 43 of the SDLP. It would also comply with the framework insofar as it relates to local services and facilities in rural communities. Now, turning to Mr. De Courcy's evidence and examination, a great deal of evidence was put forward suggesting that the description of development, was wrong, and that in his professional opinion, the proposals were more akin to C3 than C1 apart hotel suites. Our understanding is that the SDMP do not agree with this statement, of which we concur. Mr. De Courcy confirmed his only experience of the holiday let market was a single unit he owns that was managed by an agent. He is not a licensed leisure expert, so I question his authority on what C1 apart hotel suites look like and how they operate. He also confirmed he had no first-hand experience of visiting the tap room or the Queen's, so is entirely reliant on second-hand information to form his views on the accommodation offering, the tap room, and the previous uses. Turning to Dr. Ryan Miss Palmer's evidence, they both provided great detail of their experience of the Queen's in a historical context only. However, both of them confirmed they've never visited the tap room, they have no licensed leisure operator experience. So based on those two simple admissions, how can they possibly know if the current operation at the Queen's is not inclusive, available, accessible, or of equivalent or better quality and does not cause an unreasonable shortfall in provision? Turning to Mr. Ferguson's evidence, on the tap room, Mr. Ferguson suggests the opening hours and the size of venue for events and reduced food and drink offering are a concern with regards to SD 43. But Mr. Rooney, who runs the tap room and confirmed in his evidence the wide range of customers aged 18 to 90 who he has served since opening in 2023, He's also confirmed the substantial drink offering they serve in the tap room, and they hold events free of charge, such as birthdays and sports events. He also confirmed they've been serving a cold platter offering for over a year until recently, and only the lack of an oven and extraction is holding back a hot food offering. They are now serving a hot food offering via an outside catering firm currently in the car park, and he cited the pizza nights being a great success. With more success comes more investment, and like any new business, sensibly, it's one step at a time. On the field study centre point, Mr. Ferguson suggests the SDMP are concerned about the availability and higher cost of this aspect to the community, bearing in mind its principal use as a field study centre. Our view is this is much too literal and doesn't take account to the fact that this is proposed to be a multi-purpose space, multi-use space. This is a commercially led enterprise and always has been in years gone by. Any pricing for using the facility is demand-led and should not be for the planning system to decide how much to charge. The previous free use suggested by some at this inquiry was never really free. It was reliant on purchasing food or drink to enable that use, as Dr. Rai pointed out in her evidence. With regards to the visitor accommodation, he confirmed the accommodation arrangement proposed is just different than previously so not necessarily less than or of a lower quality. He considered the accommodation would be less accessible due to the Gilbert White wedding access. But when I worked through a worked example with him on bed spaces, he didn't want to be drawn on the figures, but simple maths of 7 beds against the 11 beds proposed should provide that the application far exceeds the current provision of bed availability, even allowing for the maximum number of weddings at the Gilbert White House under its current consent. I believe it to be up to 25 a year. Turning to the overdevelopment and the impact on the Selborne Conservation Area, again, reading the words from the case officer's report CD12, September 21, the Queen's is a non-designated heritage asset with the Selborne Conservation Area and is located close to a number of listed buildings. The former pub is of local historic interest and it contributes to the character and appearance of the conservation area. The contribution the former pub makes derives from its form, materials and elevational treatment. The proposed redevelopment of the pub for apartments would maintain these elements of significance, thus preserving the character and appearance of the conservation area. The refurbishment of the former pub, the removal of the unsympathetic single-storey additions and tarmac hardstanding, and the introduction of traditional boundary treatments would be an enhancement to the conservation area. The conversion of the barn for residential use would see this building given a new lease of life and ensure its retention for long-term conservation. The Design and Landscape Officers' joint response, no objection, subject to revised parking, access parking and conditions. Savills, in their final rebuttals, it remains the appellant's case that the appeal proposals offer a holistic approach to the redevelopment of the site. The appeal scheme would preserve and enhance the character and appearance of the Selborne Conservation Area and setting out of nearby listed buildings. The development would have no adverse impact on the amenities of neighbouring residents, and the landscape nature of the site would be retained through the retention and provision of trees and hedgerows. Each respective use would have sufficient parking in accordance with the adopted parking standards. The barn conversion would make efficient and effective use of the land and would provide a sustainable form of development, contributing positively, albeit modestly, towards the housing needs of the district in providing a new residential dwelling. The scale and form and massing of the proposed tourist accommodation block has been iteratively worked up in close association with the landscape and heritage officers. Its location and architectural detailing is a direct response to the council's comments, CD 15 App 6. At the meeting on the 15th of April 21, it was agreed that the appellant would undertake a local character assessment of Selborne to inform the updated plans for the accommodation block. On review of the character study, it will be clear to the inspector that the relocation of the accommodation block, flush with Huckers Lane, and the timber cladding of the building can be seen as a direct reference to buildings within close proximity of the site and local landscape character. Turning to Inspector Shearing again, in 2022, reference CD 20, while the site would accommodate a mix of uses, the community use would be focused at the front of the site, addressing the more busy high street. The residential and tourist accommodation would be primarily accessed via the back of the site, respecting the more quiet nature at the rear. The nature of those uses complements those of the surrounding area and will preserve the character of the SCA. Huckers Lane is a narrow street set between flank ends of buildings on the high street. A number of smaller detached buildings of various design exist to the southern eastern side of Huckers Lane, behind the buildings which address the high street. These smaller scale buildings, together with mature trees and foliage further along Huckers Lane, contribute to the transitioning character from the village to the countryside beyond. The proposed new single-storey building would respect the character and form of other detached buildings behind the high street, and as above, would not detract from the main Queen's building. While the new building would have its elevation directly on the street edge, I observed during my site visit that the relationship is common within the SCA, where several buildings have elevations adjoining the edge of the road. As such, it would not appear at odds, but would integrate with and respect its setting. The positioning of the new building would entail the removal of the existing hedgerow which lines the edge of Huckers Lane and which contributes in part to the introduction of the verdant character to the north. Despite this, due to its size and low eaves level, the new building would not obstruct longer views to the countryside to the north, and views of mature trees would remain apparent from the high street. For these reasons, despite the dilution in rural character at this point, I do not find the removal of the hedgerow would be harmful to the significance of the SCA. As the appeal scheme would respect the settlement pattern and existing built forms within it, it would conserve and enhance the landscape and scenic beauty of the South Downs National Park and its cultural heritage. Turning to Miss Tushingham's evidence, we heard Miss Tushingham explain to the inquiry that the views from Huckers Lane will capture glimpses of built form on 7.2a photograph A. We contend that is not the case. No views of inside the scheme will be visible from that vantage point. She says the extension to the barn is not subservient, but the extension proposed to the barn has no impact on the conservation area. She also tells us the hip roof of the accommodation block on Huckers Lane should be of gable design as per the Battery building. But Inspector Shearing says the proposed barn extension and new single-storey building alongside Huckers Lane would be appropriately scaled and detailed to appear as visually subordinate structures to the main Queen's building. The main Queen building is of hipped design, but so are three other buildings on Huckers Lane adjacent to the proposed accommodation block. She says the loss of garden is of serious harm. However, Inspector Shearing said the following on the garden point. This would result in a substantial reduction in the extent of green and open space at the back of the site and subdivision of the space. Despite this, an Ordnance Survey map of 1897 shows that a number of outbuildings previously existed on the appeal site, of which only one barn remains, and a pattern of development behind the main frontage is a common characteristic of the area, particularly on the north-eastern side of the High Street. Miss Tushingham has concerns the trees on the rear of the site that have been removed, and actually we've already replanted as required by the TCA, have opened up the site further to what was there. Sorry, I've just updated that. We agree where the ash trees and cherry trees have been removed and replanted and currently does open that part of the site up to the countryside views. We think this is an overall positive, as Miss Childs mentioned in her examination. What is important to note are the 4 mature trees still in place that the inspector hopefully saw at the rear of the site are the key trees that provide screening for the proposed car park. The only lawful tree removal was for creating the access to the new proposed car park, and more trees have already been planted, leaving the site in a net gain position currently. The concerns on the boundary treatments, curbstones, bin stores can surely all be dealt with via Landscape Condition 9 in the SOCG. We are unsure why there's been so much discussion on these points. Turning to Miss Childs' key points, settlements and buildings. Initially discussing the single-storey elements, she was, these are her words, you do say they contribute to a historic value individually. Sorry, that's my words. And then she replies, yeah, that's true. So, okay, yeah, there's certainly a value to the site's character. So if that is true, then Miss Childs has confirmed to the inquiry that a single-storey toilet block located in the front car park is adding historic value to the site and adds to the site's character. We can understand the nature of sites in Selborne have many single-storey structures within the grounds, but we do not understand this particular reference to a toilet block that was removed from the front car park as part of our recent works. There was concern of using painted weatherboard on our new ancillary block elevation abutting Huckers Lane and drawing the existing smaller barn as a comparison in her evidence. However, the existing buttery building proposed to be retained is painted vertical timber, which is where the design cue came from. I think that, just adding in something here, relates to what Mr. Mohammed was in effect trying to discount my original statement of you need to look at this part of the site from a 3D aspect, not a 2D aspect, to understand how those two buildings would work together in the context of the finished built form. So I just thought that's worth adding in. Further, she says, and that new ancillary building is actually proposed to be weatherboard, which might be appropriate for a small working building, but the treatment of this building isn't really in keeping with that as a choice of material. But I will go back to the buttery building on the street scene is of similar length building to the new proposed ancillary block and the front and side elevation of vertical timber. It therefore follows, in our opinion, these two structures would read as a pair from a distant viewpoint. She goes on to say our barn extension and accommodation block are not subservient in her view. However, Inspector Shearing says the proposed barn extension, the new single-storey building alongside Huckers Lane, would be appropriately scaled and detailed to appear as visually subordinate structures to the main Queen's building. Turning to landscape, Miss Childs under examination states, so when you undertake a landscape visual impact assessment, best practice affords the opportunity for you to incorporate design iteration into your assessment of harm. We reply, and I did not cross-examine her at this point because I did not have the knowledge in the room, but I have gone back and checked my facts, and a landscape character assessment was not a validation requirement for this application in September 2020. That is a very important point in our view, as much has been made about this aspect. Ms. Childs continues, so the application is supported by what's been called a landscape principles plan. I think it's also within the design and access statement of the full application. And that plan was submitted a little bit after the initial site layout and everything. And the plan shows highlighted in different colours some landscape interventions that are proposed. And as you can imagine, I see quite a lot of planning application, and this struck me as one that was slightly retrospective in that layout had already come forward and the landscape interventions were being proposed on top of that layout. I don't think it's been demonstrated in order to be landscape led. In really basic terms, it's about understanding the landscape character of a site and using that to influence a design. I've not seen any evidence that the site and its landscape character has been understood and then adequately influence the design proposals. So despite this, our timeline clearly shows that the landscape principles document was submitted with our application of 2020, but I needed to go away and research that point after the inquiry. So I heard Mr. Mohammed mention this before, and it may well be that I'm duplicating something here, but I just wanted to qualify when we submitted our application in September 2020, there was a design and access statement with landscape principles, and I've put it into Appendix 1 on this closing statement. Then in October 2020, there was an updated one with CGI visuals showing limited interventions proposed, as I spoke about before with regards to Miss Megani's comments. And so we had 5 iterations of this, and it went through from January 2021 through to March 2021, where finally at March 2021, that's where we got to a fixed point on the buildings, and we updated our tree root protection plan, our landscape proposals, the green root protection system came in, and the ARB method statement and updated tree surveys. March 2021 was the first time the buildings became fixed, and as I've just mentioned, it was submitted by our landscape consultant, Jay Partridge. There were a few more updates between March and September of that year, followed by the planning decision in 2021. And Jay Partridge, our landscape consultant, provided his tree and landscape information throughout the application, but at slightly later dates to the architects who were sending the overarching site plans between the case officer and ourselves. So Ms. Child's evidence at the inquiry doesn't, in our view, reflect the various discussions between September 20 submission and March 21 agreement with the case officer that the building positions were now fixed before bringing forward the full landscape proposals. The working documents through the application was the site plan, which was updated from various consultee comments, and this clearly picks up the building changes. The soft and hard landscaping changes from September 20 to September 21. The ARB statement and landscape plans were submitted less frequently. Turning to spaces, Ms. Child confirms with regards to the gardens. Yeah, I think the space is also valuable. Not only are they obviously green, but the varied size of them really contribute to their rural character of the village. And you can see, as a result of their linear nature, the single row of buildings with their large plots backing onto the countryside. It means the countryside is available visually and sort of literally to people within the village. It's just there, and it also helps bring in that sense of rural character that I think is really valued, because that's also another sort of characteristic allowed in the village design statement. Well, our view is that the barn proposal, the ancillary accommodation building and the accommodation on the rear of the Queen's building will enjoy that exact description above. The loss of the main garden has to be balanced with the cumulative benefits across the scheme. Looking down the access at the rear of the site towards Plumtree House, we were asked by the Conservation and Landscape officers to move the parking from the edge of the development, as I pointed to on that Appendix 2 CGI visual, that's where the parking was originally located. We didn't think this was necessary, but followed the advice, which took the parking into the middle of the site. It is, in our view, a direct action that they forced on the application rather than, as Mr. Mohammed suggested to me in the inquiry, that we were packing development into the site. Turning to routes, Miss Childs discusses the route hierarchy of the village with her worked examples, and our view is our plans from Huckers Lane help support this. We do accept that the highways consultation will have had an impact on our design reviews. However, as stated, every change was pared back to a minimum in response to the landscape-led approach. The blank rear elevation of the visitor accommodation would have been preferred from a landscape and building perspective. However, as the plans show, the insertions to be thin vertical windows deliberately spaced to not create a standard residential form. Turning to vegetation, she says we've got sort of sporadic trees now, but there's no sort of linear sense any longer, and we've lost the treed backdrop. So some of the trees that have been removed due to ash dieback were very mature trees and very tall trees. And so that sort of tree line backdrop is no longer able to be experienced on the site. And those forest scale trees are not proposed to be replaced. So the tree replacement is generally of quite small scale. The ash trees have been replaced with native specimens, as I hope seen on the inspector visit, even though there was no requirement in the tree application to actually do that. There are now more trees on the site than when this application was submitted, as seen on the inspector's visit. The only tree missing in the tree belt is the one to access the new proposed car park. What is important to note are there are 4 mature existing trees, not 2 as stated by the landscape officer. Again, I only had to refamiliarize myself with the site to confirm that position, but if anybody came and viewed the site today, they would see those 4 still in position, still in place, that the inspector saw at the rear of the site, and are key trees that provide screening for the proposed main car park. The proposed new car park will be well screened by these remaining trees. SD43 tourism query of the Rule 6 party. I was asked by Mr. Riley Smith about why I didn't provide additional rooms for the visitor accommodation, which would prevent the need for the ancillary block in the garden. That does not consider the holistic approach we took in our initial study in 2020 with the Gilbert White House on the range of uses for the site. It is therefore disingenuous to look at the end result and ask why the barn is not being used for visitor accommodation. Just on the tourist point, I just made a note for myself, which is not in my closings, but I will add it in. The 2014 Tourist Accommodation Review Report cannot be taken seriously for the reasons I addressed at the committee. It's 10 years old. A lot has changed in that time. So other matters. Susan Knight, submission regarding the buttery. She said, we vividly recall a friend's birthday party in the buttery when a dancing guest actually fell through the wooden floor. This relates to the inspector asking about evidence of the quality of the existing buttery building. Selborne Stores Limited. You've seen the statements made by this group, which are part or aligned with the Rule 6 party. We suggest to you, Inspector, they are in fact a competitor of ours, and as such will make representations against our proposals as it's in their commercial interests. We suggest they're not representative of the village, as proven by the limited number of members, 72 on their website currently, compared with a village of 600 plus. Turning to the parish council objection, the extraordinary meeting to decide on whether to change the objection noted to the inspector some months ago was last Thursday, 14th of November, prior to the inspector being notified last Friday. We hold the audio recording and transcript of the meeting, which contains representations by the Rule 6 party, including Rye, Palmer, Montague, Dawson, Clay, Masson, Bennett, Blackburn, Robertson, Ravenscroft. If it would help your decision on what weight should be given to that parish council objection, we'd be happy to provide it to you as part of this inquiry. Turning to the Rule 6 party, we suggest, Inspector, this small minority of the village are also commercial competitors of ours and have spent the last 9 years trying to convince us to sell the Queens to one of their various pseudonyms. It is for this reason, Inspector, the decision was taken in 2020 that no marketing evidence could realistically be put forward with any forthcoming planning application due to the consistent approach of unrealistic offers being put forward for the purchase of the site. As Adrian Montague stated in his submission to this inquiry, he was part funding an offer to purchase the Queen's site prior to our involvement. The Rule 6 party have been active objectors for the last 9 years, and the group were incorporated as a limited company until they reached the High Court in 23, where suddenly they were simply represented as Dr. Rye and required protection by the Aarhus Convention. We question the authenticity of this group and those professionals assisting them. Mr. De Courcy chose to use these words to describe our application in his evidence conclusion. The appellant has chosen to carry out significant works to the site prior to the quashing of the former appeal decision. These works are unauthorised and should this appeal be dismissed, would be no doubt subject to enforcement action. The words "no doubt be subject to enforcement action" are patently incorrect, as proven by multiple visits by the enforcement officer, and are defamatory. So the planning balance, what happens if the appeal is dismissed? We, as you've heard this afternoon, will be left with no option but to proceed with completing the scheme under its existing use classes, and the loss to the community will be felt, as it won't be as wide-ranging as the application in front of you today, and the 99-year peppercorn lease to the Gilbert White House may fall away. If the appeal is allowed, we'll complete the development without delay, and the community will benefit from the long-term use of the commercial frontage on the High Street via the Gilbert White House, which we feel is a very positive move for Selborne to help move past this gridlock. So in conclusion, the site has moved through various uses as stated in our evidence in years gone by. Our proposals are for very modest interventions in our view in terms of building form and landscape elements. The other previous uses suggested by the Rule 6 party were in times gone by, and we understand are fondly remembered. However, the current status of the remaining spaces used most recently as a delicatessen, the barn, and a restaurant, the butchery, are derelict spaces with the only practical use being currently for storage. Turning to the SDMP's evidence, we do not believe matters have changed substantively since the last appeal of 22. This application was recommended for approval by the professionals at the South Downs National Park, and only when the application reached the committee did it fail, with highly questionable behaviour of a few committee members leading the room and reading from a pre-prepared script. Evidence not only with my own eyes, but also Miss McGenney in her evidence to the inquiry. The Rule 6 party and their various pseudonyms may wish to continue for years to come, trying to prevent any form of development at the Queen's. That is their prerogative. We've built a partnership with the Gilbert White House to bring community benefits to this village. They are a charity and can't be expected to wait years in the planning system for an outcome on progressing their aims, and this application goes to the heart of the problem with the UK planning system currently, where in our view it is overly complex, and with enough resources, objectors are able to prevent progress of high quality development coming forward. Charities running museums are on a knife edge in terms of viability, and anything we can do to help create viability should be welcomed. The chairman of the trustees of the Gilbert White House summed up in his conclusion to this inquiry, While we understand and we respect the fervour held by what is a small but vocal minority of Selborne residents, we feel there's no excuse for conjecture, hyperbole, and in some cases, downright counterfactual statements about our museum and its enterprises. Indeed, we find it curious these individuals still profess themselves to be supporters of Gilbert White. In closing, I should say that such egregious mistruths about our charity must surely serve only to cast doubt about the veracity of the other elements of their evidence. So, Mr. Inspector, we would encourage you to find in favour of the appellant. In our view, Inspector, to the benefits of this scheme, the LPA and the Rule 6 parties' assertions to the contrary are unsubstantiated, unevidenced, and anecdotal. The appeal scheme represents an unrivalled opportunity to deliver a truly complementary facility to the existing businesses within the village and deliver a valuable resource for the local community. We do accept the general criticism of the residential field to the rear of the site we have put forward in our proposals. However, this must be balanced against the entire frontage remaining commercially led, which helps this central high street location. Inspector Shearing states, while the site would accommodate a mix of uses, the community uses would be focused at the front of the site, addressing the more busy high street. The residential and tourist accommodation would be primarily accessed via the back of the site, respecting a more quiet nature at the rear. We kindly request, Inspector, you allow the appeal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Macklin. Just want to check Mr. Riley Smith is with us. Yes, indeed he is. Just one thing, Mr. Macklin.
Yep.
You did mention towards the end that you had transcript and audio of the recent parish council meeting.
Yes.
I don't need that, frankly.
Okay.
I simply wanted to know, because there were suggestions to the contrary, I simply want to know what the position is. I now know the position.
Okay, understood.
So thank you very much indeed, Mr. Macklin, for that. Unless there are any other matters related to closings, first of all. Any applications for costs from any party?
Not from us, sir.
No, getting shakes of the head. Okay, that then concludes our business today, and indeed concludes the inquiry. Thank you very much, all of you, for your time and help. The inquiry is now closed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.